Well, today is the final in our 4-week series on how long, high, deep, and wide is the love of Jesus Christ out of Paul's prayer for the Ephesians, out of Ephesians chapter 3. And so as we head out into the summer, we want to take a look, finally, at this, what it means to go deep with God. To go deep in our lives, in our relationship with God, in life in general. Time magazine a few years ago did a cover article on what is destroying family life in America today. And they didn't talk about infidelity or violence. They didn't talk about drugs or education problems. What they identified as the thing that was destroying family life more than anything else was this breathless pace of activity, the busyness that we have in our lives that leaves us frantic and frenzied, that leaves us harried and hurried, this soul-depleting pace that we keep up in our lives. And now, to be honest, we are busy people, aren't we? I mean, that's just kind of a given, isn't it? We live particularly in a city where there's so many options all of the time, and we're being pulled in 100 different directions. We have our work life, and then we have our personal life, and our social life, and our financial life, and our professional life. There's so many aspects. We have demands and chores and problems and bills and pressures, so many things to deal with. And so it only makes sense that at some point we kind of need to pick up the pace, don't we? Just to get by, just to get it all done. And so we try to do things a little faster. We start to talk a little faster. We begin to try to move from task to task a little faster, get from place to place a little faster, drive a little faster. We start trying to multitask so that we can get more done in less time. But the problem is that before long, busyness gives way to hurriedness. Isn't that right? And there is a difference between the two, isn't there? Between being busy and being hurried. Being busy is a condition of our body. It's about moving fast and doing a lot of things and getting a lot done. But being hurried is something altogether different, isn't it? When we're hurried, we start to become distracted. We have less time to really give ourselves to anything. We become frustrated and resentful and filled with anxiety. We start seeing people as obstacles to the things that we want to get done. Isn't that right? I mean, tell me, how many of you have found yourself coming up to a stoplight and you're trying to choose which lane to pull up behind, and you don't just count the number of cars in each lane, but you start noticing what the make and year and model of each car is, trying to figure out which side is going to pull away faster when the light turns green, maybe save you a couple seconds on your day. Or else when you go to the grocery store, you find yourself choosing a checkout line, not just based on how many people are in each line, but you start thinking about things like the age of the people in the line. Whether they look like the kind of people who might be using coupons, right? Ever? Do you ever do that? If you're really bad, you start multiplying the number of people in each line with about how many items it seems like each person has. Or if you're really, really bad, you start keeping track of the people in the other lines who would have been you if you had chosen that line, right? And then it's like ruins your day if any of them get out of the store before you do. Am I right? When it gets really bad, you go home at night so exhausted, so depleted, so harried, that you drop into bed and you try to hurry yourself to sleep. Have you ever done that? Have you ever tried to rush to get to sleep? It doesn't work out very well, does it? When James Catford was here, my friend from London, he was best friends with a man named Dallas Willard, a very famous theologian who passed away a few years ago. But in this last couple of years, while he was battling cancer, the big mantra that he was pushing on anyone who would listen is that hurriedness is the great spiritual detractor of the modern age. He said over and over again that hurriedness is a condition of the soul that keeps us away from the most important things in life. That our hurriedness is what keeps us from being able to experience God's love and God's grace, keeps us from being able to experience joy and contentment and satisfaction in relationships. That it's the thing that keeps us from going deep with the things that actually matter. Isn't it true? I mean, think about it. It's kind of the ultimate irony, isn't it? That you would think that if our lives are very full and busy, if we're moving very fast and getting a ton done every day, that our lives should feel more full and more complete. Isn't it true? No, isn't it just the opposite? I know when I am busiest, I feel less satisfaction and less contentment. I feel like my life is less full than at other times. And the reason is because in our busyness, in the pace of our lives these days as we move so quickly from thing to thing, what gets sacrificed is depth. Isn't it true? It's one of the hallmarks of so many lives today that it's miles wide but only a few inches deep. The great plague of our society today is our shallowness and our superficiality. I heard someone say that we're like a bunch of ferrets on a triple cappuccino. As we race from one glittering distraction to the next and never take time to think any more deeply about it. It's the depth in our lives that ends up being hurt. We get our news from USA Today. They say that it's the paper for people who don't have time for the in-depth analysis of television. I remember the last time Vet started getting the New Yorker again, and I tried to read an article. I felt like I was reading War and Peace. Isn't it true? That our minds have become so scattered, so distracted that we don't take the time to go deep? We've gotten to the point where we worship at the altar of busyness, and we measure our success and even our very worth by how fast we're moving and how much we are accomplishing. The truth is, I don't care whether you're a success or not. I'd much rather see you sane and healthy and whole and fully alive. I long for you to know that there are only a few things in this world that actually matter, but that those things matter immeasurably. And so if I could give you a gift today, if I could somehow wrap it up in a little box with fancy paper and a bow, it would be simply the permission to just sit still, to think, to pray, to reflect, to try to connect the dots and see where it is that you've been and where it is that you're going. Do you ever take time to just sit still? If you're like me, you probably feel guilty anytime you're not doing anything. Is that right? And yet God knew from the beginning that this was one of the most important things that we can do in our short time that we have on this planet is take time to think deeply about things, to think deeply about who we are and who God is and what we're doing here on this planet in the first place. This is why God gave us the Sabbath. In God's good wisdom. This is why God made it, was so important to God. God made it one of the commandments, the one right between that one about taking the Lord's name in vain and that other one about honoring your mother and your father. Do you remember? He says this, Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. The whole idea of Sabbath, it's kind of a quaint concept to us these days, isn't it? Like, who could possibly do that? We have enough troubles just setting aside the time to come to church every week. Isn't it true? And yet, in recent years, the theologians have become more and more convinced that this idea of recapturing the Sabbath, this idea of taking it seriously, is one of the most important challenges that we're facing in the 21st century. Just a couple years ago, PCUSA at the General Assembly's Ministries Division Council level, they started a work group to look into this idea of Sabbath rest. I mean, really, only the Presbyterian Church USA could start a work group to look into the idea of working less, right? And yet, it's always been so important to God. In ancient Israel, it was one of the most important things because they understood how critical the idea of Sabbath was if they wanted their communities to be healthy and whole. And so in the Old Testament, the punishment for ignoring the Sabbath, well, just listen. From Exodus 31. For 6 days work is to be done, but the seventh day is a day of Sabbath rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day, and everyone, why don't we read this together, is to be put to death. Now, I'm glad it's not quite that way now. I think we'd all be in trouble if it was, but I think we can all agree that if we regularly ignore Sabbath, if we regularly ignore rest in our lives, we'll be walking around like we're dead anyway. Isn't it true? And what I want to point out this morning, the main point that I want to make this morning is that I don't think it is just so that we can rest, although it certainly is that. I think that the Sabbath has been declared holy so that we have a chance to go deep. Right? I mean, when you look at where the Sabbath came from, it comes all the way back to the very first chapter of Genesis. We don't believe at this point that Genesis was supposed to be a scientific textbook, but it certainly is holy and inspired verses that tell us a lot about who we are and how we were created and why we are the way that we are. And in this first chapter, God goes through the first 6 days of creation, right? And in each day, God creates something different. And there's this pattern that we see emerging. Each time a day passes, each time something else is created, it says at the end of it, and God saw that it was good. It's like there's this rhythm that's set up from the very beginning, in the very first verses of the Scripture, where God creates and he makes something, and then he sits back. And he soaks it all in. He rests and he sees that it's good and he figures out how it all fits into a greater plan and he connects the dots and he sees the way that it all works and he sees this thread, this story that's underlying all of the various stories and all of the work of creation. At the end of chapter 1 it says this: God saw all that he had made and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning the 6th day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. See, I don't think that this was coming just because God needed to rest. It's an interesting theological question, isn't it? Do you think that God rested because he was tired? Does God get tired? Was God so exhausted from all of his work that he needed to lay down? Was he lying on the couch with the remote control, flipping through the channels, and he dozed off to sleep? No. You know, it was Aristotle in his famous classic, Ethics, that he talks about rest, and he reflects the mindset of the ancient Greek philosophy that rest was for the purpose of regaining your strength, of recharging your batteries. For the ancient Greeks, the purpose for rest was a means to an end, and that end was more work, was being able to rest enough so that you could get right back at it and hit it hard. But ever since the beginning, the ancient Israelites, they had totally the opposite understanding of rest. They saw rest, and they saw it codified in these first verses of Genesis. They saw rest for rest's sake itself, so that we can stop and enjoy the creation, enjoy what we're doing. From the very beginning, when God makes heaven and earth, and then God makes man and women, God gives us work to do. And the work is good. We're supposed to till the soil and to herd the animals and to care for and steward God's creation. But then God builds into a time for us to sit back, to take a step back, to unplug from what we're doing, and to take time to go a little deeper, to see a little more, to see how it all fits together, to connect the dots, to understand where we've been and where we're going, to try to pull it all together. When Yvette and I were doing our scuba diving dive masters in the Parentian Islands in Malaysia, we learned pretty quickly that just under the surface, just 10 or 20 meters down, there was this beautiful world filled with gorgeous, small but colorful fishes and corals that you could get distracted with and look at all day. And yet what we learned pretty quickly was that if you want to get to the bigger stuff, the more important stuff, you had to dive deep. And it wasn't so easy, because if you did a deep dive, you needed to do a lot more preparation. You needed to use a lot more oxygen. You needed to be very intentional about getting ready to go and do these deep dives. But it was in these deep dives that you would see the really big things, the really interesting things. It was there that you would see the stuff that was most important. We're heading into summer. For many of you, that means a slightly different cadence of life, some slightly different nuances to your schedule, maybe even a little bit of time away. But I want to impress upon you that even time away, if you're just having fun, if you're just rushing from thing to thing, even if you're resting and getting good sleep, it's not going to mean anything unless you take the time to be still, to go deep, to reflect and to pause on your life, to pray and to journal and to see how the dots are connected. This year has been a difficult year for many of you and even for this congregation, and to be able to just pause and stop, to go deep and reflect and think deeply about who you are and where you're going, who we are as a congregation and where we're going as a congregation. Let me close with this story. Last week, our children had their spring piano recital right here in the garden room. Do you all remember those stress-free times of recitals? Anybody? Anybody have recitals when they were young for various things? And immediately, with our kids, I realized that they already are so much further along than I ever was. They're already doing such complicated pieces with these incredibly fast rhythms. But where I really noticed it is that they made a few mistakes in their recital last Saturday. But my kids, when they would get to a spot and they'd forget something and they'd stop, they just took a breath and they started again, right from where they had left off. It was so different than me. I remember when I was growing up in a recital, if I made any mistake, I had to go back and start from the beginning. Because I had memorized the notes. I had even memorized what order they were in and the sequence they were in. But if something went wrong, I didn't know where I was. I had to go back and put note after note, stringing them together again. And I realized in that garden room last week that the difference is my kids have made that, turned those notes into a music that's living inside of them. They've figured out how those notes fit together and what the music is, and it's become a part of their soul. It's because they spend so much time practicing. They play the piano before they go to bed at night. They play it again before they leave for school in the morning. And it was such a difference than when I was a kid to see that this was in them. You and I, these lives that we're living in the 21st century, are so often like separate notes which are strung together, and we move so fast from thing to thing, even our great accomplishments. We spend all this time and energy, we get it done, and then we move on to the next thing without even taking a moment to notice or recognize or remember where we've been. What we need is the time. We need to be still. We need time to turn those notes into music. Time for us to understand what's going on around us and what's been going on in our lives and inside of us. A chance for us to think deeply about God and about life and about our life and where we've been and where we're going and why it's important and why we're even here in the first place. What we need is to dive deep. To spend time in the important stuff. It's going to take some preparation, setting aside some time, some intentionality. It even takes a little more oxygen than we're used to. But it's down there where all the important stuff is. I hope this summer you will figure out a way, you will take the time to sit still and to think deeply and to connect the dots and to put it in perspective and to process it all so that you can actually be living this short life we have. Amen.